So the graphs we looked at had a difference between, let's go back, a difference between an average variable cost and an average total cost curve. And we had other graphs with an average fixed cost curve. When you see a graph like that where your average total cost and your average variable cost curves are different, you should be able to answer a question of whether you're in the long run or the short run rather quickly and easily. You're in the short run. Why are you in the short run? Well, because you have some costs that are fixed. At least one cost is fixed, or one input is fixed. It can't be changed. Now, again, an example of this might be if you have to pay a certain amount of rent. When I worked for the Robicellis, we had a warehouse in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. It's just this ugly looking warehouse district. If you're ever driving by it on the Belt Parkway, a whole bunch of anonymous looking warehouses and a ton of different businesses work out of those warehouses. And what we had there was a shared kitchen space that a lot of different food vendors throughout the city would use to produce whatever food they sold, and then they would transport it from that kitchen space to their storefront or whatever other market they had to transport it to whoever their customers were. And it was a very large industrial sized kitchen with large industrial sized kitchen equipment that could be used to make however much needed to be made. And there were rental agreements that, as it turns out, the person who owned the kitchen space was very particular about making sure that every dime in the contract that he was owed that he got. And you signed the rental agreement for, say, a year. So that would be a fixed cost that no matter how much your quantity is, if you sign that contract saying, I will pay you this amount of rent for the next year, every month that rent check is going out, even if you end up never making anything. You're already legally on the hook for it. Now we can get into complexities about bankruptcy law and so forth. You go to court, you can get a different settlement amount, but we don't go into those complexities in economics because, again, it's economics. Well, we don't want to deal with reality. We want to deal with nice, simple models, right? So the way we would look at that, that's a fixed cost. At the end of that year, you can let that lease expire and you can produce at different amounts. But for right now, whether you produce 0 units, 100 units, or whatever, that cost is there at all times. So we didn't always operate out of that kitchen. At some point, we decided we need a larger space to operate out of, so we rented that kitchen out. And then later on, because we were also paying rent for a storefront, when we were moving out of that storefront, we moved into a different one that had enough kitchen space to handle all of our production needs, but it also was large enough to serve as a storefront. It was in a place in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn on 5th Avenue, and it was just the perfect spot for it. We were able to consolidate those costs. We were able to produce the same amount as before, but we didn't have to rent 2 different places for 2 different purposes. It's difficult to find a space like that, but we were able to do it. So that particular arrangement changed. So when were we in the long run? Well, we're never in the long run. That's the answer, which is maybe a little dissatisfying. And then we get into mind-blowing existentialism here, I guess, when you say that you are never in the future and you never will be. Because once you're in the future, it's now the present. Ooh, isn't that cool? That's just, now I'm getting dizzy, right? Because the way it makes you think. Yeah, so you can never, ever make it to the future because when you do, it's your present. You will never be in the future. Never, ever. It'll only be your present once you get there. You can never be in the past either. You were in the past once, but it was your present. You're always in the present. Always. You are never not in the present. That's always where you are. You can plan for the future. You can remember the past, but you're always in the present. So, what does this have to do with short run and long run? Well, you are always and forever in the short run. Now, it says here, all inputs of production can be changed. So then you're in the long run, right? Well, technically at some point you pay for something, it's incorporated into your costs and your planning, and that can't change no matter what your output levels are. So we can play semantics and get into the details, but generally speaking, the long run is more of a planning horizon, while the short run is where you are at the moment. So the long run is when all these inputs of production can be changed. So we have that obligation to pay rent at that kitchen space, no matter what we produced. So in the short run, that was a fixed cost. But the long run planning horizon was, can we alter our production levels or change our cost structures around a little bit at some point when that lease agreement expires? And the answer was yes, and we did. So when you can change one of your production inputs, that's the long run, but you're never there. Once you do change it, you have new arrangements and new fixed costs in the short run. So the long run is always a planning horizon, but we still talk about it at this point as though it is something you're in. Just like we can talk about the future in terms of when we get there, this is what we're going to do, but we're going to keep it as talking about the future because we don't know what's going to happen, and etc. So technically, you're never in the long run, but there are long run planning horizons to keep in mind, and that is, can we open a new factory? We don't have it yet, but is it worth taking out the loan or getting new investors and raising the funds to get that factory built so that our production capacity has gone up by a lot and we're no longer seeing our marginal costs rising at these production levels? We can produce a lot more and still make it affordable. And what I just described here is what we're going to get into as we talk about the long run. Economies of scale in particular. But the long run, the short run, you got at least one fixed cost. In the long run, all costs are variable costs, which means, I was likening it to this curve goes away, or this graph. This curve, the average variable cost is gone. You just have the U-shaped one and your marginal cost, and that's it. This average total cost curve is the average variable cost curve in the long run because all your costs are variable. Open up a new plant, close down an existing plant. Get a new leasing agreement, let an existing one expire. Fire a salaried worker, hire a new salaried worker who you're going to have to pay over the long term anyway. Whatever you want to conceptualize as a fixed cost, those are all variable costs in the long run. So these two curves are no longer different. They're one and the same. So you just have one curve in the long run. So that's what I just described. It's a curve showing all of your different average costs at every given level of output. And this seems a bit messy, but what this is these are a bunch of different possible short run scenarios. So in the short run, you're going to have variable costs and fixed costs, but we're just looking at it from a planning standpoint where at different output levels, our average costs are falling, and then they hit a minimum point, and then they go up. Or we could produce at this level, average total cost 2, where they're falling, but then at this point where with this production capacity represented by average total cost 1, when it starts going up, we have more production capacity here, we have more factories or whatever. It's not as costly to produce more. You don't have to pay as much overtime. You have more capital equipment. So your average total costs are still falling until this production level, and then they start rising. Or you can massively increase your production levels to be at average total cost 3, when average total cost has been rising for a while, average total cost 3 is still falling. And where average total cost 2 has been rising for a while, average total cost 3 is still falling, and then finally it starts to rise out here. So these are 3 possibilities in your planning horizon, 3 different average total costs that you can choose from. And you have more than these 3. You have an infinite number of average total cost curves that might be right here, and they might be up here, and they might be up here, and way down here. They can be in a lot of different places, but they are going to take a certain shape similar to what we're seeing here, which is going to come into a little more focus, where at quantity 1, we have it at a minimum point on the first average total cost curve, but we're at a declining level, average total cost 2. At quantity 2, it's at a minimum point on average total cost curve 3. As you increase output, you get to that point. And then we expand out further, we take away some of the other curves, we get a long run average total cost curve that looks a little bit like the outline of a steer's skull in the desert or whatever. We're in the process of kind of smoothing it out right now, but we're starting with several average total cost curves, and then we're noting that there are minimum points for each of them, and we're connecting minimum points to eventually get a long, smooth average total cost curve. And note this is the long run average total cost curve, but it's just like the one in the short run where it goes down for a bit, hits a minimum point, and then it starts to rise. And what this long run average total cost curve is, going back here, you have the minimum point of this one, and you have the minimum point of this one, and you have the minimum point of this one. And you have a whole bunch of minimum points of a whole bunch of average total cost curves that make up this long run average total cost curve. These are all the infinite different planning horizons you can have, and you pick one of them, and that minimum point on one of them is going to be associated with a given output level. And something to notice about this long run average total cost curve, this again is every single possible short run total cost curve that you can have as your production capacities increase. So one out here is going to have rising average total cost very early on, but in the long run, they're still falling. And then at some point, no matter where you're at, whichever short run curve you're on, your long run curves are just going up. And these are what we call the different points, the different scale economies you can have. So defining what I mean by economies of scale, a condition in which the long run average total cost of production decreases as production increases. This is when you have economies of scale, meaning as your output increases, your average total cost is going down. Want to make another unit here, your average total cost gets even lower and lower and lower. You have economies of scale here. Constant returns to scale, a condition in which the long run average total cost of production remains constant as production increases. That's going to be right here. At some point here, different output levels are going to give you the same average total cost. And then you have diseconomies of scale, a condition in which the long run average total cost of production increases as production increases. So now output is going up at every level. At this point, your long run average total cost will continue to rise. And this is another way of drawing a long run average total cost curve where you might have constant cost of production at every output level. And you have economies of scale here. This is also where you have increasing returns to scale. Those are used interchangeably, meaning the more you produce, the lower your average total costs are. Constant returns at this point, your average total costs are not changing as you produce more, and then eventually your average total costs are going up. That's when you have diseconomies of scale. Now, a few things to note here. First of all, this is why big businesses aren't outlawed, even though there's a lot of complaining about them. When we look at perfect competition pretty soon here, we're going to note that your average total cost is going to be where your price is. And this is why big box stores are able to have lower prices. Their scales of production are much larger. So their average total costs are lower. They can charge lower prices. As long as they sell all this output, they're going to be able to make more money that way. And they're going to be able to undercut people who have to produce here. Now, one thing that's going to be tempting to say is that you don't want to ever be out here, but that's not necessarily true. If all your competitors' average costs are up here, you might still make more money here. This is just capturing the reality that at some point administrative costs or whatever, your business gets too big and you're gonna reach a point where your average costs are just going up with higher costs of production.